All right, the feature focus for today is checklist. All right, these things are powerful, super helpful to make sure that you and your team are doing the things that you've spelled out to do each step of the way in your pipeline. So as an example, when you have the appointment set for a property and you have certain things that you need to do, right? You've got to run comps, you've got to determine the after repaired value. You might want to look at whether there's code compliance issues, cases against the property, all that kind of stuff. You could have in a checklist to make sure they're done before it moves on down the pipeline. So as an example here, I've got this one on West Woodlawn. I'm going to click on that. And then down, if you scroll down, you can see what checklists are here. So I have a general checklist with an item here, and then I have a status checklist, okay? The status checklist is for the current status, the appointment set checklist. So this item will need to be completed before this can move on down the pipeline. All right, so it's not going to let me right now. This one doesn't need to be finished. It's just here's a general checklist item that you can create. So let's just start with the general checklist real quick. And if I want to add a one-off item that doesn't really necessarily have to fit into that one status, I can just over here on the left click on Add Checklist Item and keep it under the general or generic, and then type in the task here and even use @mentions. So that's really cool to add it. And so that'll go into the general checklist and will not prevent the record from moving on. The status checklist is different. It will prevent the record from moving on, so this needs to be completed. So if I close this, seeing as how this checklist, and if I hover over the card, I can even see that 0 of the 1 items for the status checklist have not been completed, and it's not going to let me move that over. It'll say cannot change status with incomplete checklist. Down here at the bottom is the error I'm getting. So that forces us to complete that. So if I click this again and I come back down to the status checklist, and let's say I ran the comps, so I checked that that's done. If I close this, now I've got a green checkbox here showing that the checklist is complete for the status, and I can drag that into the next one and start moving that lead down the pipeline. So this ensures that you and your team are doing the things in your processes and your systems that are supposed to be done before something moves along down the pipeline each step of the way. So how cool is that? All right, you can edit that checklist. So most of the time you're going to need to do more than just run comps. So I'm going to add to that checklist. If I just hit the 3 buttons here at the top of the status, and you can do this for any of the statuses or columns in your pipeline, I can click that, and on the optional checklist I can start adding items here or remove other items. And so if I put run comps, I could do determine ARV. I can do check code compliance. And you get the idea. You can just put all the different things that you want to have checked before that appointment is done. And so I'm going to hit save status. Now if I move a record into this, okay, from somewhere else. So if I'm moving this down, I've got the appointment set, and I'm going to go ahead and choose the date that appointment is, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Now, if I go into this record, if I scroll down to the checklist, status checklist, I see that all of these now are required, right? Because that's what I said for the status. So anytime a record's now going to come into that, a lead's going to come into that status, it's going to get this checklist that needs to be completed before it moves further down the pipeline. So this is awesome. And a thing to note is currently you can do mentions in the generic or the general checklist for these one-off mentions, one-off checklist items. If you have items in the status checklist, then you cannot mention, okay? You can't mention people in those ones that default into the status at the moment. You can use them in one-off items that you add to it, which is another distinction. So if I wanted to mention Josh and tell him for this one, see if neighbor's junkie. All right, so for this particular property, when I looked at Google Street View, I noticed that the neighbor's houses look really run down with tons of like rundown, broken down cars in the like front yard and all that kind of stuff. So I want him to be aware of that when he goes to this appointment, because that might affect the resale value of the property. And so I don't want that checklist, that to be a part of the checklist that all of the records get when they come into the status. Just for this one record, I can add that here onto the status checklist, which will then prevent it from moving on until that's done as well. So how cool is that? This is a great way on any of these statuses to add checklists to make sure that your processes for your workflow are in FlipPilot so that your team knows already what to do when that record goes into that status and moves further down the pipeline. And when you hire somebody new, it's already built into your system and training becomes much, much easier. So that's the feature focus checklist. I hope that you're making use of them. Very, very powerful.